What's going on, YouTube? This is Venomous Media, back with another video. Let's take a trip back to the 2000s. After being down and out for nearly a decade, WB and DC attempted to bring back their two most iconic characters to the big screen. First, in 2005, we saw the Caped Crusader return with a vengeance with Batman Begins, after striking out with Batman and Robin, being praised by critics and comic fans alike for bringing bats into a more realistic and gritty world, lacking the typical comic book feel. And then in 2006, we saw the Man of Steel return, and Superman Returns. Unfortunately, lightning would not strike twice for WB and DC, as Superman Returns was panned across the board, from the casting with the exception of Brandon Routh as Superman, the plot, pacing, and trying to reboot / make a sequel to the first two Christopher Reeve movies. That could be a video for another time. Anyway, while Superman would be down and out for nearly another decade, Batman was still going strong, and in 2008, we got The Dark Knight, which was an even bigger home run than Begins, as it's considered a superior sequel by fans and critics because of the storyline and Heath Ledger's take on the Joker. And of course, The Dark Knight was not only the first Batman and DC movie to cross $1 billion, but the first comic book movie period to do so. So what was Marvel doing in 2008? Well, that's when we saw the start of the MCU, Marvel's attempt at a live-action shared universe with its heroes, something they've been trying to do since 2005. While they are missing some big players from the comics because other companies still have the rights to the characters, they still had a decent library which included Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, and Hulk, which they still shared the rights with Universal. And up to bat first was Iron Man. While it wasn't the home run The Dark Knight was, it was still a major hit at the box office, and praised among critics and fans. And of course it was the career comeback for Robert Downey Jr. after his personal troubles over the years. Up next that same year, we saw the Incredible Hulk make his return to the big screen. But just like Man of Steel in 2006, Marvel's Green Giant struck out too. Although I personally enjoyed the 2008 Hulk movie, which I'll definitely talk about in a future movie. Anyway, it wouldn't be until 2010 where we saw the next MCU film. While the MCU was prepping for the next movie, there was one more Marvel comic movie that came out that year that they didn't have the film rights back to yet. And it's the subject of today's video. I'm talking about Punisher Warzone. Now, I've already covered the first two Punisher movies, saying I enjoyed both of them. Warzone I enjoyed too, because of the action, violent score, and Ray Stevenson looking straight out of the Punisher comics. Many fans actually consider this the best Punisher film because of all this, so let's dive into this. Now, originally this was supposed to be a sequel to the 2004 movie, with Thomas Jane returning as Frank Castle, and finally heading to New York to do battle with Jigsaw. This time around, Jane would be writing the script, and he was actually listening to feedback from the fans, while hitting the gym and training to return as the skull-wearing vigilante. Unfortunately, Jane's sequel would never be, as he dropped out of the project due to creative differences, which included Lionsgate passing on Walter Hill as the director, who Jane really fought to get the job, and the studio rejecting his Punisher pitch of being a dark and gritty movie instead of a conventional superhero film. And Jane ultimately said he didn't want to do wrong by the fans and make a movie he didn't believe in. So with Punisher 2 now called Warzone, the search was on for writers and a director. John Dahl was in talks to direct Warzone, after being considered for the Jane sequel, but passed on it because he thought the script wasn't very good and the lack of a budget. And that's when Lexi Alexander stepped in. Lexi Alexander had started her career as a martial artist and stunt performer, and even played Princess Katana in Mortal Kombat's live tour. She wouldn't transition into directing full-time until the 2000s. In 2005, she directed Green Street Hooligans, which starred Elijah Wood and Charlie Hunnam, and there were 3 writers for Warzone. First duo Art Markham and Matt Holloway, who had actually written Iron Man, and Nick Santora, who had a long resume as a TV writer and producer for shows like Law & Order, Prison Break, and The Sopranos. So who was next in line to wear the skull? Ray Stevenson would have that honor. Kevin Feige actually suggested Stevenson to Alexander, after he was previously considered for Abomination in the Hulk movie. Wayne Knight played Micro, and Dash Mahawk played Soap. So yeah, both Micro and Soap are used this time around, after being absent in the last movie. The rest of the cast include Colin Salmon, Julie Benez, character actor Doug Hutchinson, and rounding out the cast is Dominic West as Jigsaw, who actually beat out British actor Paddy Considine for the role, and even Freddie Prinze Jr., who Lexi Alexander fought to get the role after being impressed by his audition, but Lionsgate ultimately rejected him. And despite being called Warzone, this movie was actually intended to be the first entry of a series based on the Max comics. And I'll get more into the source material in just a bit, but first I want to talk about the premise. The movie starts off showing Frank Castle prepping for his next attack while watching a news report that mentions he has killed over 200 gangsters. Meanwhile, two detectives, Soap and Safadi, are staking a party held by an aging crime boss named Galatino Cesari, which Punisher crashes, nearly wiping out everybody with the exception of Cesari's capo, Billy Rosati, who witnessed the Punisher in action, is just escaping in the nick of time. After the chaos, Detective Safadi spots the Punisher and actually helps him out, saying he saw Rosati escape and gives him a car to pursue him. And soon Punisher tracks Rosati down to a warehouse and continues the carnage, wiping out some of Russo's men and trapping Rosati in a machine with glass bottles, which he survived, but his face was ultimately destroyed. And during all the chaos, Punisher learns that he actually killed an undercover FBI agent who was actually pursuing Rosati undercover. When more FBI agents arrive, Punisher leaves the crime scene. And later on, Punisher attends the funeral of the fallen FBI agent, Nikki Donatelli, where he sees that he had a wife named Angela and a daughter named Gracie. And there's also an agent named Paul Badinsky, who was Donatelli's partner, who vows to avenge him. Frank is also visiting the grave of his wife Maria and their two kids, Frank Jr. and Lisa, remembering their deaths. Meanwhile, Badinsky then joins forces with Detective Soap in his Punisher task force, and Frank is still conflicted about the agent he killed, and is considering calling it quits as the Punisher. After surviving his near-fatal encounter with the Punisher, Rosati tries to get plastic surgery, but his face is damaged beyond repair, and he takes up the name Jigsaw because the scars left on his face resemble a jigsaw puzzle, and he vows to get revenge against the Punisher, so the Punisher may not be able to retire just yet. So that was the premise. Now I'm going to talk about the source material. Just like the 2004 film, Warzone uses a mixture of things from the comics and has some original stuff too. This time around, Frank Castle is not in law enforcement like the last two films, and his military background is acknowledged more. Also, unlike the last two movies, they actually use his wife and kids from the comics, Maria, Frank Jr., and Lisa. The 2004 movie did have Maria, but gave him a son named Will, while the 89 film gave him a wife named Julie and two daughters named Annie and Felice, which again, that wasn't a deal breaker in either film since they ultimately served their purpose. But I'll give him points for actually staying true to the comics with his family. Also, I'll give them credit this time around since they're actually killed during a picnic after seeing a mob execution. Also, we finally get Micro this time around, who wasn't in either film, and the character Shake in the 89 film seemed to replace him. And of course, Detective Soap from the Welcome Back Frank storyline is in it, even though he was absent along with Detective Molly Van Richthofen, who's absent this time around. And Paul Badinsky is a minor character from the Max comics, which is fine, but his appearance doesn't make or break the movie. And finally, Jigsaw makes his live-action debut in a Punisher movie, after being absent in the last two movies, which used original villains instead. And the only minor changes are his last name is Rosati instead of Russo, but he's still called the Butte, so that's not a problem for me. Then they give him a brother named Looney Bin Jim, who wasn't in the comics, which is fine. That just means he's there for the body count. So yeah, they used a good amount of source material while doing their own thing. Although like the 89 film, this doesn't directly follow a specific storyline from the comics. Just the overall concept of the Punisher as a character, with little source material thrown in. And Stevenson actually read every issue of Max at the time to prep for the role. Now onto the action, which in my opinion is probably the best we've gotten any adaptation of the Punisher. I mean, there are over 100 kills on screen, as well as plenty of blood and gore. So many badass and creative kills, from guns, knives, and he even uses his bare hands a couple of times. Now I'll talk about the costumes. I really love Punisher's tactical suit he uses this time, with the skull on his flak jacket. It's so badass. He looks like he's ready to go to war. And I love how Jigsaw looks in this movie. He looks straight out of the comics. Unlike the Punisher TV series we got in 2017, where we see Russo get his face destroyed and yet all he gets is minor cuts, which I don't know why, if they ran out of money or Ben Barnes didn't want to do it. Whatever the reason was, Jigsaw just has some bad scratches on his face, which was stupid. And honestly, John Berthel's Punisher at times looked more like Jigsaw than Jigsaw himself. Before you tell me it's realistic, well, we got Two-Face in The Dark Knight, which was Batman set in a real-world setting. I don't want to hear any MCU apologists defend that awful Jigsaw. And I think the only real problems with this movie for me is at times the villains are cartoonish, like Jigsaw. He really reminds me of Tommy Lee Jones' Two-Face in Batman Forever.
Hey, Two-Face, show me how to punch a guy!
It's dirt simple, my boy. Ball up the fist, reach way back, and assert yourself.
Where on paper, you had the right actor for the role, but the script didn't help. And of course, Looney Bin Jim is even more hammy. And as far as comic villains go, I doubt this version of Jigsaw will make anyone's favorite comic movie villains list. However, like I said, I'm glad we at least got to see Jigsaw, because he looks the way he does, straight out of the comics. And of course, I mentioned with the 2004 film, while the supporting cast wasn't bad, they weren't very memorable either. And that's the case here too, an extent. And to be honest, that's par for the course with the Punisher, since he kills almost all of his villains and doesn't really have much of a supporting cast, except Micro and a few characters who've been able to be reoccurring. He's not like Batman, Spider-Man, Superman, Daredevil, or even Moon Knight, who all have a great supporting cast. So yeah, it is what it is. My only other minor grip with this is it's pretty basic as far as a story goes. Not just as a comic movie, but as an action movie too. This isn't Rambo, Commando, Dirty Harry, Death Wish, or even the Mel Gibson movie Payback. But still, it's very enjoyable, well worth the watch. Overall, minus the campiness and the script at times, I do think all the actors did a great job with what they were working with. Like I mentioned, Ray Stevenson looks just like the Punisher out of the comics. From his size and look, he really does look like Punisher from some of the Warzone comics, or the art by Tim Bradstreet, or Lan Medina. And Jigsaw too looks spot on. And Wayne Knight as Micro is one of the best castings in a live-action comic adaptation. He looks so much like Micro. I don't know what they were thinking with the guy from the Netflix show. And now I'll talk about the soundtrack, which did have a few bangers on it, from Rob Zombie, Slipknot, Static X, Rise Against, Slayer, and Seether. Not as memorable as the 2004 film, but it still had some kick-ass tracks. Like I mentioned before, I enjoyed the previous two Punisher movies, but overall I think Warzone is the best Punisher adaptation as far as the action, gore, and tone of the comics goes. As I mentioned earlier, this was supposed to be part 1 of a new Punisher film series based on the Max comics, with Barracuda supposedly being considered for the villain in a future sequel. But unfortunately, another Punisher never came to be, as it bombed hard at the box office. Even harder than Howard the Duck and Elektra, which were the lowest grossing Marvel comic movies at the time. I'll do a retrospect on those one day. However, as of 2024, the lowest grossing Marvel comic movie is The Marvels, which couldn't even make its budget back, which I don't feel bad for. They kept trying to push Captain Marvel down our throats. If you want a good movie with Carol Danvers, make her Miss Marvel again. So yeah, Warzone deserved way better at the box office. I'm glad more and more comic fans are appreciating the movie as time goes on. Unfortunately, with Warzone being the worst grossing Marvel movie at the time, Stevenson never got his chance to dome the skull again, but he did secure a bit part in the MCU in the Thor movies as Volstagg, and tragically he passed away last year at the age of 58. I thank you, Mr. Stevenson, for bringing such an iconic character to life, and wish you really got to play him more. And of course, Marvel eventually gained the rights back to Punisher from Lionsgate, and he made his debut in the MCU 2006 on the second season of Netflix's Daredevil, played by John Berthel, which honestly was great casting, and I think they did a great job with the Punisher there. And he eventually got his own show in 2017, which honestly was a disappointment in my opinion. If you want me to discuss why I dislike the Punisher TV series, comment down below and I'll get to it. It ran for 2 seasons and was cancelled along with the other Netflix Marvel shows when Disney decided to put all the Marvel shows on Disney+, and he's scheduled to return to Daredevil Born Again and will likely get his own show soon after. So we'll have to wait and see if it's any good. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say about Punisher Warzone. What do you think about the movie? Did you like it? If so, what did you like? If not, what didn't you like about it? Also, what's your favorite Punisher movie or adaptation? Who's your favorite Punisher actor? And let me know down below if you have any ideas for my next comic retrospect. Make sure you comment, like, and subscribe. This is Venomous Media signing off.